Hey, 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 you know what time it is? Woo! Get into it! Yes! We're back, lovelies. We're back. And hold on, it seems my camera's a little smudgy. Okay, that's better. That's way better. Okay. Hi, how's it going? I know, don't talk about me. Actually, you know what? Y'all, even though I haven't had a retwist since August, my hair looks really good still. Like, I love my dreadlocks. Yes, I call them dreadlocks. You do not have to correct me or like when you're talking to me. Other people have their reasons as to why they call them what they call them, but I don't see dreadlocks as a bad term. Locks or twists, I don't see as an offensive term either, but I call them dreadlocks because I don't see them as dreadful. It's, in a way, like many other people in the world, I would imagine, it's my reclamation of the term because I don't see them as dreadful. That was white Europeans coming up with that. Locks and twists, that's totally fine. That's accurate to the culture, but for me, I like to call them dreadlocks, and a lot of other people who are black and brown who also have dreadlocks also call them that. And even those of the European Viking variety, who do have tooling dreadlocks, also call them that. So I always just ask about how people, what would you like? What do you call these, or what would you call your hairstyle? What style is that? I think that's a safer way of asking rather than assuming and then somebody getting offended and be like, actually they're locks, or actually they're kiki twists, or actually they're Bantu knots, which I've had Bantu knots, and it was a cute little look for a little bit. It really was. Shout out to Carmen. I love you so much. Now, we are back, and I know it's been 2 weeks since we've read Stuart Little, and I do apologize. My body has been very tired. Once the weekend ends, it's very busy at my job. I love my job. It is not a chore for me to be at work, and I really want to emphasize that before somebody goes running their mouth. But I love my job. I love what I do for people. I love connecting with people. I got to bring a lot of smiles to people, and not just me, but like all the coworkers I have, the employees I work with. It was a good weekend. A couple of hiccups here and there, but it wasn't anything to ruin the day or ruin the weekend for that matter. So, at least for me, I can't speak for anybody else. So, I've been very tired after work, so I really wanted to push myself to be here and to be present today. And again, thank you so very much for your patience. So, I'm going to give us a bit of a good chunk to get through because, truth be told, this is not a super long story. But I love Stuart Little for the simplicity of this adventure. It's not overtly complex of how this story goes, and I really love that. And the way it ends is, well, we'll get there when we get there. Chapter 6. A Fair Breeze. There we go. One morning when the wind was from the west, Stuart put on his sailor suit and his sailor hat, took his spyglass down from the shelf and set out for a walk. Full of the joy of life and the fear of dogs, with a rolling gait he sauntered along toward Fifth Avenue, keeping a sharp lookout. Whenever he spied a dog through his glass, Stuart would hurry to the nearest doorman, climb his trouser leg, and hide in the tails of his uniform. And once, when no doorman was handy, he had to crawl into a yesterday's paper and roll himself up in the second section till danger was past. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, there were several people waiting for the uptown bus, and Stuart joined them. Nobody noticed him because he wasn't tall enough to be noticed. There he is, scoping out for danger. See the dog on the corner of the sidewalk? Yeah. I'm not tall enough to be noticed, thought Stuart, yet I'm tall enough to want to go to 72nd Street. When the bus came into view, all the men waved their canes and briefcases at the driver, and Stuart waved his spyglass. Then, knowing that the step of the bus would be too high for him, Stuart seized hold of the cuff of a gentleman's pants and was swung upward without any trouble or convenience whatever. Stuart never paid any fare on buses because he wasn't big enough to carry an ordinary dime. The only time he had ever attempted to carry a dime, he had rolled the coin along like a hoop while he raced along beside it, but it had got away from him on a hill and he had been snatched up by an old woman with no teeth. After that experience, Stuart contented himself with the tiny coins which his father made for him out of tin foil. They were handsome little things, although rather hard to see without putting on your spectacles. When the conductor came around to collect the fare, Stuart fished in his purse and pulled out a coin no bigger than the eye of a grasshopper. "What's that you're offering me?" asked the conductor. "It's one of my dimes," said Stuart. Is it now? Well, I'd have a fine time explaining that to the bus company. Why, you're no bigger than a dime yourself. Yes, I am, replied Stuart angrily. I'm more than twice as big as a dime. A dime only comes up to here on me. And Stuart pointed to his hip. Furthermore, he added, I didn't come on this bus to be insulted. I beg your pardon, said the conductor. You'll have to forgive me, for I've had no idea that all in the world there was such a small sailor. Live and learn, muttered Stuart tartly, putting his change purse back in his pocket. The bus stopped at 72nd Street. Stuart jumped out and hurried across to the sailboat pond in Central Park. Over the pond the west wind blew, and into the teeth of the west wind sailed the sloops and schooners, their rails well down, their wet decks gleaming, the odd owners, boys and grown men, racing around the cement shores, hoping to arrive at the other side in time to keep the boats from bumping. Some of the toy boats were not as small as you might think, for when you got close to them you found their mainmast was taller than a man's head, and they were beautifully made, with everything shipshape and ready for sea. To Stuart they seemed enormous, and he hoped he would be able to get aboard one of them and sail away to the far corners of the pond. He was an adventurous little fellow, and loved the feeling of the breeze in his face, and the cry of the gulls overhead, and the heave of the great swell under him. As he sat cross-legged on the wall that surrounds the pond, gazing out at the ships through his spyglass, Stuart noticed one boat that seemed to be finer and prouder than any other. Her name was Wasp. She was a big black schooner flying the American flag. She had a clipper bow, and on her foredeck was mounted the 3-inch cannon. She's the ship for me, thought Stuart, and the next time she sailed in, he ran over to where she was being turned around. Excuse me, sir, said Stuart to the man who was turning her, but are you the owner of the schooner Wasp? I am, replied the man, surprised to be addressed by a mouse in a sailor suit. I'm looking for a berth in a good ship, continued Stuart, and I thought perhaps you might sign me on. I'm strong and I'm quick. Are you sober? Said the owner of the Wasp. I do my own work, said Stuart crisply. The man looked sharply at him. He couldn't help admiring the trim appearance and bold manner of this diminutive seafaring character. Well, he said at length, pointing to the prow of the Wasp out toward the center of the pond, I'll tell you what I'll do. You see that big racing sloop over there? I do, said Stuart. That's the Lillian B. Womrath, said the man, and I hate her with all my heart. Then so do I, cried Stuart loyally. I hate her because she's always bumping into my boat, continued the man, and perhaps her owner is a lazy boy who doesn't understand sailing and who hardly knows a squall from a squid, or a jib from a jibe, cried Stuart. Or a luff from a leech, bellowed the man. Or a deck from a dock, screamed Stuart. Or a mast from a mist, yelled the man. But hold on now, no more of this. I'll tell you what I'll do. The Lillian B. Womrath has always been able to beat the Wasp sailing, but I believe that if my schooner were properly handled, it would be a different story. Nobody knows how I suffer, standing here on shore, helpless watching the Wasp blunder along when all she needs is a steady hand on her helm. So, my young friend, I'll let you sail the Wasp across the pond and back, and if you can beat that detestable sloop, I'll give you a regular job. Aye, aye, sir, said Stuart, swinging himself aboard the schooner and taking his place at the wheel. Ready about. One moment, said the man. Do you mind telling me how you propose to beat the other boat? I intend to crack on more sail, said Stuart. Not in my boat, thank you, replied the man quickly. I don't want you capsizing in a squall. Well then, said Stuart, I'll catch the sloop broad on and rake her with fire from my forward cannon. Foul means, said the man. I want this to be a boat race, not a naval engagement. Well then, said Stuart cheerfully, I'll sail the Wasp straight and true, and let the Lillian B. Womrath go yawing all over the pond. Bravo! Cried the man, and good luck go with you. And so saying, he let go of the Wasp's prow. A puff of air bellowed out the schooner's head sails. She paid off and filled away on the port track, heeling gracefully over to the breeze, while Stuart twirled her wheel and braced himself against a deck cleat. By the by, yelled the man, you haven't told me your name. My name is Stuart Little, called Stuart at the top of his lungs. I'm the second son of Frederick C. Little, of the city. Bon voyage, Stuart, hollered his friend. Take care of yourself and bring the Wasp home safe. That I will, shouted Stuart, and he was so proud and happy he let go of the wheel for a second and did a little dance on the sloping deck, never noticing how narrowly he escaped hitting a tramp steamer that was drifting in his path with her engines disabled and her decks awash. Chapter 7. The Sailboat Race. When the people in Central Park learned that one of the toy sailboats was being steered by a mouse in a sailor suit, they all came running. Soon the shores of the pond were so crowded that a policeman was set from headquarters to announce that everybody would have to stop pushing. But nobody did. People in New York liked to push each other. The most excited person of all was the boy who owned the Lillian B. Womrath. He was a fat, sulky boy of 12 named Leroy. He wore a blue serge suit and a white necktie stained with orange juice. "Come back here," he called to Stuart. "Come back here and get on my boat. I want you to steer my boat. I'll pay you $5 a week, and you can have every Thursday afternoon off and a radio in your room." "I thank you for your kind offer," replied Stuart, "but I'm happy around the Wasp. Happier than I have ever been in all my life." And with that, he spun the wheel over smartly and headed his schooner down toward the starting line, where Leroy was turning his boat around by poking it with a long stick, ready for the start of the race. "I'll be the referee," said a man in a bright green suit. "Is the Wasp ready?" "Ready, sir," shouted Stuart, touching his hat. "Is the Lillian B. Womrath ready?" asked the referee. "Sure I am," said Leroy. "To the north end of the pond and back again," shouted the referee. "On your mark, get set, go!" "Go!" cried the people along the shore. "Go!" cried the owner of the Wasp. "Go!" yelled the policeman. And away went the two boats for the north end of the pond, while the seagulls wheeled and cried overhead, and the taxicabs tooted and honked from 72nd Street, and the west wind, which had come halfway across America... Sorry, I'm tripping over my words, I apologize. The west wind, which had come halfway across America to get to Central Park, sang and whistled in the rigging and blew spray across the decks, stinging Stuart's cheeks with tiny fragments of flying peanut shell tossed up from the foamy deep. "This is the life for me," Stuart murmured to himself. "What a ship! What a day! What a race!" Before the two boats had gone many feet, however, an accident happened on shore. The people were pushing each other harder and harder in their eagerness to see the sport, and although they really didn't mean to, they pushed the policeman so hard they pushed him right off the concrete wall and into the pond. He hit the water in a sitting position and got wet clear up to the third button of his jacket. He was soaked. This particular policeman was not only a big, heavy man, but he had just eaten a big, heavy meal, and the wave he made went curling outward, cresting and billowing, upsetting all manner of small craft and causing every owner of a boat on the pond to scream with delighted consternation. When Stuart saw the great wave approaching, he jumped from the rigging, but he was too late. Towering above the Wasp like a mountain, the wave came crashing and piling along the deck, caught Stuart up and swept him over the side and into the water, where everybody supposed he would drown. Stuart had no intention of drowning. He kicked hard with his feet and thrashed hard with his tail, and in a minute or two he climbed back aboard the schooner, cold and wet but quite unharmed. As he took his place at the helm, he could hear people cheering for him and calling, "At a mouse, Stuart! At a mouse!" He looked over and saw that the wave had capsized the Lillian B. Womrath, but that she had righted herself and was sailing on her course close by. But she stayed close alongside till both boats reached the north end of the pond. Here Stuart put the Wasp about and Leroy turned the Lillian around with his stick, and away the two boats went for the finish line. He's just having a rough time, but it's okay. This race isn't over yet, thought Stuart. The first warning he had that there was trouble ahead came when he glanced into the Wasp's cabin and observed that the barometer had fallen sharply. That could mean only one thing at sea: dirty weather. Suddenly, a dark cloud swept across the sun, blotting it out and leaving the earth in shadow. Stuart shivered in his wet clothes. He turned up his sailor blouse closer around his neck, and when he spied the Wasp owner among the crowd on shore, he waved his hat and called out, "Dirty weather ahead! Wind backing into the southwest, seas confused, gas falling." "Never mind the weather," cried the owner. "Watch out for flotsam dead ahead." Stuart peered ahead into the gathering storm, but saw nothing except gray waves with white crests. The world seemed cold and ominous. Stuart glanced behind him. There came the sloop, boiling along fast, rolling up on a bow wave and gaining steadily. "Look out, Stuart! Look out where you're going!" Stuart strained his eyes, and suddenly, dead ahead, right in the path of the wasp, he saw an enormous paper bag looming up on the surface of the pond. The bag was empty and riding high, its open and gaping wide like the mouth of a cave. Stuart spun the wheel over, but it was too late. The wasp drove her bowsprit straight into the bag, and with a fearful whoosh, the schooner slowed down and came up into the wind with all sails flapping. Just at this moment, Stuart heard a splintering crash, saw the bow of the Lilian plow through his rigging, and felt the whole ship tremble from stem to stern with the force of the collision. "A collision!" shouted the crowd on shore. In a jiffy, the two boats were in a terrible tangle. Little boys on shore screamed and danced up and down. Meanwhile, the paper bag sprang a leak and began to fill. The wasp couldn't move because of the bag. The Lilian bee Wormwrath couldn't move because of her nose was stuck in the wasp's rigging. Waving his arms, Stuart ran forward and fired off his gun. Then he heard, above the other voices on shore, the voice of the owner of the wasp yelling directions and telling him what to do. "Stuart! Stuart! Down jib! Down staysail!" Stuart jumped for the halyards, and the jib and the forestaysail came rippling down. "Cut away all paper bags!" roared the owner. Stuart whipped out his pocket knife and slashed away bravely at the soggy bag until he had the deck cleared. "Now bring your foresail and give her a full!" screamed the owner of the wasp. Stuart grabbed the foresail boom, pulled with all his might. Slowly, the schooner paid off and began to gather headway, and as she heeled over to the breeze, she rolled her rail out from under the Lilian's nose, shook herself free, and stood away to the southward. A loud cheer went up from the bank. Stuart sprang to the wheel and answered it. Then he looked back, and to his great joy, he perceived that the Lilian had gone off in a wild direction and was yawing all over the pond. Straight and true sailed the Wasp, with Stuart at the helm. After she had crossed the finish line, Stuart brought her alongside the wall and was taken ashore and highly praised for his fine seamanship and daring. The owner was delighted and said it was the happiest day of his life. He introduced himself to Stuart, said that in private life he was Dr. Paul Carey, a surgeon dentist. He said model boats were his hobby and that he would be delighted to have Stuart take command of his vessel at any time. Everybody shook hands with Stuart. Everybody, that is, except the policeman, who was too wet and mad to shake hands with a mouse. When Stuart got home that night, his brother George asked him where he'd been all day. "Oh, knocking around town," replied Stuart. Chapter 8. Margalo. Because he was so small, Stuart was often hard to find around the house. His father and his mother and his brother George seldom could locate him by looking for him. Usually they had to call him, and the house often echoed with cries of, "Stuart! Stuart!" You would come into a room and he might be curled up in a chair, but you wouldn't see him. Mr. Little was in constant fear of losing him and never finding him again. He even made him a tiny red cap such as hunters wear so that he would be easier to see. One day, when he was 7 years old, Stuart was in the kitchen watching his mother make tapioca pudding. He was feeling hungry, and Mr. and Mrs. Little opened the door of the electric refrigerator to get something. Stuart slipped inside to see if he could find a piece of cheese. He supposed, of course, his mother had seen him, and when the door swung shut and he realized he was locked in, it surprised him greatly. "Help!" he called. "It's dark in here. It's cold in this refrigerator. Help! Let me out! I'm getting colder by the minute." But his voice was not strong enough to penetrate the thick wall. In the darkness he stumbled and fell into a saucer of prunes. The juice was cold. Stuart shivered and his teeth chattered together. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mrs. Little again opened the door and found him standing on a butter plate, beating his arms together to try to keep warm, and blowing on his hands and hopping up and down. "Mercy!" she cried. "Stuart, my poor little boy!" "How about a nip of brandy?" said Stuart. I'm chilled to the bone." But his mother made him some hot broth instead and put him to bed in his cigarette box with the doll's head hot water bottle against his feet. Even so, Stuart caught a bad cold, and this turned into bronchitis, and Stuart had to stay in bed for almost 2 weeks. Now, keep in mind, the story is set in the 1930s. Keep this in mind. Technology nowadays, even if it was bronchitis, with the medicine that we have, you would only be out for a few days, not for 2 weeks. Keep that in mind, okay? During his illness, the other members of the family were extremely kind to Stuart. Mrs. Little played tic-tac-toe with him. George made him a soap bubble pipe and a bow and arrow. Mr. Little made him a pair of ice skates out of 2 paper clips. Poor Stuart. And no parent likes to see their child sick. That's just tough. One cold afternoon, Mrs. Little was shaking her dust cloth out of the window when she noticed a small bird lying on the windowsill, apparently dead. She brought it in and put it near the radiator, and in a short while it fluttered its wings and opened its eyes. It was a pretty little hen bird, brown with a streak of yellow on her breast. The Littles didn't agree on what kind of bird she was. "She's a wall-eyed vireo," said George scientifically. "I think she's more like a young wren," said Mr. Little. Anyway, they fixed a place for her in the living room and fed her and gave her a cup of water. Soon she felt much better and went hopping around the house, examining everything with the greatest care and interest. Presently, she hopped upstairs and into Stuart's room when he was lying in bed. "Hello," said Stuart. "Who are you? Where did you come from?"
"My name is Margalo," said the bird softly in a musical voice. "I come from fields once tall with wheat, from pastures deep in fern and thistle. I come from vales of meadow sweet, and I love to whistle."
Stuart sat bolt upright in bed. "Say that again," he said.
"I can't," replied Margalo. "I have a sore throat."
"So have I," said Stuart. "I've got bronchitis. You better not get too near me. You might catch it."
"I'll stay right here by the door," said Margalo.
"You can use some of my gargle if you want to," said Stuart. "And here's some nose drops. And I have plenty of Kleenex."
"Thank you very much. You are very kind," replied the bird.
Did they take your temperature?" asked Stuart, who was beginning to be genuinely worried about his new friend's health.
"No," said Margalo, "but I don't think it'll be necessary."
"Well, we better be sure," said Stuart, "because I would hate to have anything happen to you. Here," and he tossed her the thermometer. Margalo put it under her tongue, and she and Stuart sat still for 3 minutes. Then she took it out and looked at it and turned it slowly and carefully.
"Normal," she announced.
Stuart felt his heart leap for gladness. It seemed to him that he had never seen any creature so beautiful as this tiny bird, and he already loved her. "I hope," he remarked, "that my parents have fixed you up with a decent place to sleep." There's Margalo.
"Oh, yes," Margalo replied. "I'm going to sleep in the Boston fern on the bookshelf in the living room. It's a nice place for a city location. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think I shall go to bed. I see it's getting dark outside. I always go to bed at sundown. Good night, sir."
"Please don't call me sir," cried Stuart. "Call me Stuart."
"Very well," said the bird. "Good night, Stuart."
She hopped off with light bouncing steps. "Good night, Margalo," called Stuart. "See you in the morning." Stuart settled back under the bedclothes again. "There's a mighty fine bird," he whispered and sighed a tender sigh. When Mrs. Little came in later to tuck Stuart in for the night and hear his prayers, Stuart asked her if she thought the bird would be quite safe sleeping down in the living room.
"Quite safe, my dear," replied Mrs. Little.
"What about the cat, Snowball?" asked Stuart sternly.
"Snowball won't touch the bird," his mother said. "You go to sleep and forget all about it."
Mrs. Little opened the window and turned out the light. Stuart closed his eyes and lay there in the dark, but he couldn't seem to go to sleep. He tossed and turned, and the bedclothes got all rumpled up. He kept thinking about the bird downstairs asleep in the fern. He kept thinking about Snowball and about the way Snowball's eyes gleamed. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he switched on the light. "There's just something in me that doesn't trust a cat," he muttered. Ironic. "I can't sleep knowing that Margalo is in danger." Pushing the covers back, Stuart climbed out of bed. He put on his wrapper and slippers. Taking his bow and arrow and his flashlight, he tiptoed out into the hallway. Everybody had gone to bed and the house was dark. Stuart found his way to the stairs and descended slowly and cautiously into the living room, making no noise. His throat hurt him. He felt a little bit dizzy. "Sick as I am," he said to himself, "this has got to be done." Being careful not to make a sound, he stole across to the lamp by the bookshelf, shinnied up the cord, and climbed out onto the shelf. There was a faint ray of light from the street lamp outside, and Stuart could dimly see Margalo asleep in the fern, her head tucked under her wing. "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast," he whispered, repeating a speech he had heard in the movies. Then he hid behind a candlestick and waited, listening and watching. For half an hour he saw nothing, heard nothing but the faint ruffle of Margalo's wings when she stirred in dream. The clock struck 10, loudly, and before the sound of the last stroke had died away, Stuart saw two gleaming yellow eyes peering out from behind the sofa. "So," thought Stuart, "I guess there's going to be something doing after all." He reached for his bow and arrow. The eyes came nearer. Stuart was frightened, but he was a brave mouse, even when he had a sore throat, which is the definition of bravery and courage. True courage is acknowledging that you are scared in this moment, but you go ahead and face whatever it is anyway. Acknowledging that you are scared, but still wanting to face it. That is true courage. Acknowledging all of the factors that may be frightening, acknowledging that you might not come back unscathed from the situation, but to still do it, that is true courage. He placed the arrow against the cord of the bow and waited. Snowbell crept softly toward the bookshelf and climbed noiselessly up into the chair within easy reach of the Boston fern where Margalo was asleep. Then he crouched, ready to spring. His tail waved back and forth. His eyes gleamed bright. Stuart decided the time had come. He stepped out from behind the candlestick, knelt down, bent his bow, and took careful aim at Snowball's left ear, which was the nearest to him. "This is the finest thing I have ever done," thought Stuart, and he shot the arrow straight into the cat's ear. Snowbell squealed with pain and jumped down and ran off toward the kitchen. "A direct hit," said Stuart. "Thank heaven." "Well, there's a good night's work done." And he threw a kiss towards Margalo's sleeping form. It was a tired little mouse that crawled into bed a few minutes later. Tired, but ready for sleep at last. Which I think you children should be getting ready for sleep, because we have school tomorrow. And it's Christmas week. Technically, Christmas is on the following Monday. Not this Monday, but next Monday. But yes, it is Christmas week. So for those who celebrate, Merry Christmas. For those who don't, Happy Holidays. Happy Hanukkah for those who celebrated Hanukkah more recently. And upcoming after Christmas is Kwanzaa. So Happy Kwanzaa. And Happy Winter Solstice. And without further ado, I wish you a lovely good evening. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.